Okay, so hi, welcome to this cognitive approach revision session. Oh, um, that's okay. I don't need to click join because I'm going to record this externally from my OBS instead of using Craig. Yeah, it's more convenient. All right, so um, let's start with the principles of cognitive approach. So, um, in reviewing, there's four there's four types of principles in cognitive approach. First would be that mental processes can be studied scientifically, and mental representations guide behavior. Cognitive processing do not function in isolation, and biases in cognitive processing can be studied scientifically. So all of these principles are formed from from the history of how cognitive psychology developed and etc. It's not that important, but if you remember, it had this the history of it had a significant contribution to the current principles that we have on cognitive psychology. Okay, um, so in this revision session, I'm going to try to cover as much theories as possible, so that um, you guys can review on like the theories that uh, we learned in the previous psychology classes, and this is what we're going to cover. So we're going to start with cognitive processing. Um, if you remember correctly, you're going to have to learn the models of memory, and there is two main kinds of memory. The first would be that it's implicit memory. So implicit memory are the memories that cannot be consciously recalled. It's um, so it's kind of the kind of memory that doesn't appear when you remember. It's something that you already have in mind automatically. Examples of this would be procedural memory, or um, using past experiences in schema to um, to encode new memories. For explicit memory, you can consciously recall them when you try to think about it. For example, one example of this would be declarative memory. It's the kind of memory where when you think about the memory would start popping, either through like a video or a snapshot or maybe voice. And now we're going to go into the types of memory that we learned in psychology IB, which is the multi-store memory model and working memory model. So the first would be the multi-store memory model, which consists of three separate components, according to Atkinson and Schifrin in 1968. The first would be sensory memory, which detects and holds information. It's the kind of information that just that can come from anywhere, but you aren't consciously aware that you're taking input from this kind of memory. And however, if you pay attention to these memories, to these sensory memory, it gets transferred into short-term memory. And in short-term memory, the capacity of having memory is limited to around 7 units for 30 seconds, and it will disappear. However, if you continuously rehearse this short-term memory, it can become long-term memory, which has unlimited capacity and duration. So this is a clear diagram on how the multi-store memory works. It goes from sensory information or sensory memory, then to short-term memory, and then finally to long-term memory after rehearsal. And usually when the long-term memory is retrieved and taken out, it will go back to short-term memory. So um, examples of studies that can be used to support the multi-store memory model would be Glanzer and Kunitz in 1966, Sperling 1960s, and the H.M. Milner study. Um, Probably like any kind of H.M. Milner studies. Uh, if I recall correctly, one of the H.M. Milner studies, according to In Thinking, is 1966, but I actually didn't find the study that's from 1966, so I just put a question mark there. Like any H.M. patient Milner study works. So okay, so ah um I'm not sure if the date is 1966, but yeah, one of them was by Milner and Scofield. I think it was like 1956 or something. I forgot, but it's like yeah, it's 90. Okay, I stand corrected. It's 1957. And if I recall correctly from the In Thinking, there's also like another one. I don't remember which one. So basically, like any of them. Okay, so we're going to go into the working memory model. The working memory model, unlike the multi-store memory model, focuses on the workings of the short-term memory. And um, this theory was proposed by Baddeley and Hitch in 1974. So there are several components in the working memory model. And as you can see here, um, the central executive is the manager of the phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad. It's like the main thing that sort of holds them together. And the phonological loop is the one that holds the sound system. It is divided by two types. The first would be the phonological store, or known as the inner ear. So this one usually holds sound in a passive manner. An example of this would be it holds people's speech as we hear it. And then the other one would be the articulatory rehearsal component. It's basically your inner voice, and the function of it is to turn visual stimuli into sound and allow rehearsal of information from the inner ear. So, as you can see, they're quite different. One is used for, one is from your inner voice. It's like the kind of voice when you speak to yourself. That's an inner voice. However, the inner ear is like when you think of someone talking to you internally. And then there's also the visual spatial sketchpad, which is the inner eye. It holds visual and spatial information. Basically, it has something to do with everything that's visual. And another new component called the episodic buffer, which was added in the 20. Oh my god! How do I say that thing? My English is so bad. 20th century? No, that's whatever. It integrates information from other components and links this to the long-term memory structure. So, as you can see here, the central executive is like, it's kind of like your manager, the main manager of everything. The phonological loop is has something to do with phonological stuff. Basically, what that means is it has something to do with auditory information, and visual spatial sketchpad has something to do with visual and spatial related attributes, and the episodic buffer has the purpose of um, transferring these two into the long-term memory. And some studies that you can use in support of these would be the Bailey and Hitch in 1978 and Aronson and Steele in 1972. So now we're going to jump into schema theory. So schema theory states that all knowledge is organized into units. And an important thing that you should know is that there's this thing called schemata, which is a mental representation of complex knowledge. And the schemata is stored information or units of knowledge. It's basically, if you have one knowledge, it's called schemata. But we have to use psychology terms, so we have to say that it's like a mental representation of our complex knowledge. There's actually several arguments about how schemata is supposed to be about your general knowledge that you already know, but people kind of forget the actual definition of it and use it to refer to knowledge in general. And when we study schema, we study about how knowledge is represented and how it is used. So schema is known to influence memory process of all stages, the encoding, the storage, and retrieval. And studies that supports how schema influences encoding would be Branford and Johnson in 1972, and Anderson and Pickard in 1978 supports how schema influences retrieval when it comes to memory processing. So these are additional information in schema theory. I don't think it's necessary to explain all of these during the exams, but I want to explain all of them because I just like explaining psychology stuff. And so there are several types of schemas. The first would be social schema, which means that mental representations of various group of people, such as stereotypes. Social schema. Examples of social schema would be something like, a stereotype. What is it called? All right, let's just skip that because I don't think my brain is working. Another type of schema would be scripts, which are schemas about sequences and events. An example of this would be when you think of how to boil water, or when you think of the processes of how you go to school. And self-schemas would be mental representations of ourselves, or how we think about ourselves. Well, there are several ways to adjust schema, the existing schemas that we have. The first would be assimilation, which means that you apply existing schemas to understand something new. So your schema influences how you perceive something. And another way would be accommodation, as the process of changing existing schema or creating new schema due to new information clashing with existing schema. So basically, like when you have an existing schema and then you have like a new information which was crashing with your existing schema, you would try to accommodate the schema by creating another new schema that makes sense for the new information and for your previous schema, or you try to alter your existing schema so that it fits the new information. So there are two kinds of information processing in schema. The first would be the top-down processing. What this means is that your prior schema, your prior knowledge, acts as a lens for it filtering the information that you have. And in this way, your information is filtered or put in a lens of your previous information. So a study that supports this would be the study by Bogluski and Alampey in 1961 about Ratman. So for further extra information, what happened in the study was that participants were exposed with pictures of man or a rat, depending on the condition that they were put in. And then after getting exposed of pictures of rat, either rat or man, they were given an ambiguous picture of a drawing that can be perceived as a rat or a man. And the result shows that if you get exposed to pictures of rats, you would perceive that image as a rat. However, if you get exposed to pictures of a man, you would, when you see the picture, you would think of a man instead of a rat. And another would be bottom-up processing. So what happens in bottom-up processing is that you get information or perception that's not based on your prior knowledge or your schema. So you receive a new information, and you don't get influenced by your previous schema because you don't know about this information yet. Alright, so we're going to jump into thinking and decision making. There are a lot of models in thinking and decision making. However, there are two main models for them. The first would be normative models. Normative models assume that there's unlimited time and resources for decision making. And so examples of these kind of models would be formal logic, which is often used in not often used actually, which would be taught in TOK, which is deductive reasoning or deductive syllogism, which uses two premise and one conclusion. So one example of this would be, for example, I have a laptop, and then a laptop is an apple, so that means I have an apple. It's those kind of deductive reasoning. And then another model would be the theory of probability. So this is usually used in economics to analyze the success and failures of the past before decision making. It's to like predict an approximate. It's to predict the risk and the benefits of doing a certain thing. And the last would be utility theory, which involves uncertainty. So, utility theory is useful when the theory of probability doesn't work, because in real life there's a lot of uncertainties. So, utility theory calculates the expected utility and pick the best choice or the maximum choice. For descriptive models, we learn that um, we learn how like people actually do when they're thinking and decision making. So we actually find out why and how, or um, the possibilities, instead of like um, considering people's thoughts when it comes to decision making. And descriptive not descriptive models are what we're going to like learn in psychology, and what we're going to use when it comes to explaining psychological theories. And the first would be the dual processing theory, which was proposed by Stanifest and West. Or there's actually a lot of versions for this theory. There's also the one proposed by Tversky and Kahneman, but I'm basing this from In Thinking. So there are two systems of thinking according to the dual processing model, which is System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast mode of thinking, very effective, and it uses our intuition and usually put less effort in making decisions or forming judgments, because you don't put that much effort to think and consider about your decisions when you use System 1. For System 2, it has a slower conscious and rational mode of thinking, and we assume that it requires more effort because you have to actually think and ponder about your decisions. So examples of study that you can use in support of these would be Bartlett in 1932 about the Warren Ghost, or Bergman and Roediger in 1999, which was actually the replication of the Bartlett-Warren Ghost. So there's actually more studies that you can use in support of these. However, in psychology, because there's a lot of studies that we can use, and everyone has their own studies. These are merely just examples of what we can use. And the reason why I put in the replication of Bartlett is because, according to IB psychology, it's better to use studies that are above 1960s. So basically 1960s or newer studies, because apparently if you use studies that are older than that, it reduces the reliability, unless if the study is a popular study, such as the Warren Ghost study. But it's just normally safer to use the newer studies. It, well, Entromi made a very good point about why the IB psychology does that in the channel. And since I don't think anyone here is taking psychology, I'll just continue, except for entropy. But there's no more exam anymore, so. Alright, so the next theory that we have is theory of reasoned action, which was proposed by Fishbane in 1967. And the study explains the relationship between attitudes and behaviors when making choices. So, in this study, in this theory, the choices that you make, the decisions that you make depends on your behavioral intention, and this is influenced by attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control. And in 1985, they upgraded their theory and named it the theory of planned behavior. And what they did is basically they just add the perceived behavioral control into the theory. And this is an example of how theory of planned behavior works. So they assume that when you're doing decision making, you have to consider about the attitude, the subjective norm, and the perceived behavioral control altogether. And then after that, after thinking that this all of these are okay and the intention is okay, then the behavior or the decision making would happen. So, there's also another theory called the adaptive decision maker framework. It is proposed by Payne, Bedman, and Johnson in 1993, and they believe that people use a lot of strategies, a different variety of strategies to make judgment and choices. And there are 4 strategies according to this theory, which was the alternative based. There are two main strategies, and there are actually 4 kind of strategies. So the first 2 main of these would be the alternative based and the attribute based, and the 4 of these would be the weighted additive strategy and the satisfying strategy, the lexicographic strategy, and elimination by aspects. So the first one, the weighted additive strategy, basically somewhat works like the theory of probability. So you try to multiply all the attributes that you're considering with the value you think the attribute have, and then after that you literally calculate one of them using weighted sum. And people rarely do this because it needs a lot of math and a lot of effort. Unless if you enjoy doing that. And people usually only use this strategy if they're trying to maximize their accuracy of their decision making. Normal people probably never do this unless if it's like something that requires a big consideration or big decision. And this probably only happens in big companies, unless if you're crazy with math and you love calculating things. That makes sense. So another strategy you can use would be by determining the attribute that you want, and then putting them in order by comparing their values and then picking the best option between all of them. So this saves up a lot of your effort and time because you just pick the best out of the best. However, most people aren't as decisive as that, so it doesn't necessarily always work. And then another would be attribute based, which is the lexicographic strategy. In this one, you choose 2 attributes. One with the most important attribute and another one with the attribute having the best value. And then you take 2 of these and then simply compare both of them and choose between one. So this can be very ignorant to other attributes, but in reality, people often do this, and it usually doesn't reduce the accuracy. And in fact, it's a lot more efficient because you're just comparing 2 things after picking them between lots of things. And the last one would be elimination by aspects. So you choose an important attribute when you're doing decision making, and then you eliminate the option one by one until there's one option left. This can be a bit time consuming. However, it can effectively and slowly eliminate the options one by one to the one that you actually want. So, the motivation behind these strategies when making choices depends on your meta goals. And there's four kinds of meta goals. The first, like I said before, would be maximizing your decision's accuracy, which is only useful when you apply the WADD strategy. The second would be minimizing your cognitive effort. The best for this would be LEX if you're very lazy. And another is if you're trying to minimize the experience of negative emotion. So, people naturally try to avoid losses, and this can be one motivation. There's two hypotheses on why this may happen. So the first is because after decision making, the negative emotion would start giving an impact on the process of the decision making, which wouldn't be nice. Or another hypothesis is because the negative emotions that you have would influence the decision making directly. So your emotions should have been a part of the theory or the framework. And a study that supports this would be Deleuze, Batman, and Payne's, which was conducted in 1997. So the last reason why you might do any of these decisions is because you want to maximize the ease of a justification of a decision. So you wanna people wants to have a reason behind why you create this decision, and this explains the effects which was present in this in some of the research that scientists have ever made in the past that couldn't be explained in some research or in some theories. So I finished explaining the thinking and decision making theories, and now we're jumping into reliability of cognitive processes. So in psychology, cognitive processes can sometimes be questionable when it comes to its reliability. In psychology, we're here to investigate that. Thank you, Alan. And thank you for coming, even though it's not really something you take. Yeah, okay, so I'll continue. So, as I said before, because cognitive processes has questionable reliabilities, psychologists are here to investigate those kind of things. And one of the first things that they investigate would be reconstructive memory. If we refer back to the theories that I explained before, one of them would be schema theory. And as I said before, schema theory says that memory is based on schema. And there's a big role when it comes to schema and memory. And why this happens is because memory isn't, according to reconstructive memory is an active process that involves the reconstruction of information. So basically what happens is that as time goes on, our recollection of memory would start to deteriorate. And what happens when the memory starts to deteriorate is that confabulation would happen. And what confabulation is that is when schema or our knowledge, um, our common knowledge starts to help in filling the gaps of memory, making or as you can say, reconstructing the memory and continuously recreate the memory so some of the details are lost in the process, or some of the details would be um, modified that fits our common knowledge with our schema influencing the memory of recreation. So some studies that we can use to support this would be Loftus and Palmer in 1974. This study investigated on how leading questions can affect eyewitness estimation of speed. And another study that we can use would be Bahert et al. In 1975 about the reliability of autobiographical memory over time. So this study investigates about how your memory about your friends in high school would start to deteriorate, and it would be less reliable over time as time passes on. And another study that you can use again would be Bartlett in 1932 on War of Ghosts and its replication study. Do you guys want me to explain about Bartlett or Loftus experiment? Personally, my memory about them is really bad, but I still remember like the gist of it. Schema is influencing my forgotten memories. Alright, so since no one responded about me explaining about the Loftus study or the Bartlett study, I'm going to explain about biases in thinking and decision making. Wait. Doing this. Okay, so let's just proceed. So, because we're humans, we often make mistakes, or according to psychology, we make a lot of biases. So, in dual processing theory, I've explained that the system that uses our intuition can be very effective, but it is very prone to heuristics or mental shortcuts, leading to bias. And the reason why we often use this intuition is because in real life we tend to focus on limited amount of information because we have selective attention. And we also have the tendency to look for information that confirms to our existing beliefs. So, using intuition, it would be faster to confirm to what we know. So, the thinking process and decision making would be more effective. And the last one would be the tendency to avoid mental stress from cognition. So, as I said before, humans tend to avoid loss. And one of the losses we can have would be to have negative emotions. So um, we would tend, when we use our intuition, when we do things unconsciously, we would tend to avoid mental stress. And all those listed would be some of the biases that I'll be explaining about. There's a lot of biases around out there, but these are some of the ones that I found from the book and, well, totally didn't copy paste from the book. All right, so um, the first the first would be that we have a tendency to focus on limited information, right? And if we relate this to the multi-store memory, I explained before that the sensory memory can get transferred into short-term memory, and this happens, like I said before, because of the selective attention that we have. Um, and relating it to schema, the reason why we have selective attention is because um, the information that we get will be filtered by our existing preconceptions or existing schema. And the bias of this is that we would often fall into things like asymmetric dominance, framing effect, anchoring bias, and pick and roll. Um, well, I'd like to briefly remind you all that having these biases doesn't always mean that it's completely bad. Um, uh, Cognitive errors are normal, we're humans. However, in some cases, in some circumstances, sometimes it's better to not fall into these common biases. So, the first bias would be asymmetric dominance. And what happens is that when you're trying to sell something, for example, in this graph, we have several options, or maybe like buy the options that you can buy from. And if you add a decoy of a choice, it will increase the probability to choose the option that dominates the decoy. So according to the Hubert, Payne, and Puto study in 1982, when you put in graph A and give it to the participants who are conducting the study, they would probably choose A or B depending on their circumstances. However, if you give graph B to the participants, as you can see, the C is the decoy of the choices, and this would actually influence people to pick more B's because they think that there's a better or more irresistible option. And a trick to incite, like, interest people to pick A would be that you make something like graph C. So you make it seem like as if Swiss Alps is actually a good or a decent option because there's actually an option that's worse than it. And this is sometimes how people try to market things. So some certain options might seem more affordable than others. And yeah. The second would be the framing effect, which was proposed by Barron in 2008. Basically, what happens is that people tend to avoid risk, but people also take risks to avoid losses. An example of this would be the study by Tversky and Gneiman in 1981. And I don't remember the study, but it had something to do with like frame choices. In yeah, there were like several options. Hmm? Sorry, I'm reading the Discord chat and don't know what's happening. Oh, okay, that's kind of like a mod problem, a role problem. So okay, so let's continue. Another option would be the anchoring bias, and this happens when you tend to rely too much on the first information you have when you make decisions. Um, this is supported by the study of Tversky and Gneiman in 1974 and Strack and Musweiler in 1997. So um, this usually happens when um, you have learned something new. For example, you've learned a new conception or new information, and then um, after you've learned this new information, you start learning other kinds of information. And when you start learning other kinds of information, sometimes those kinds of information might not be consistent with the first information that you have. However, because the first information that we have is the first information that we've received, and it's like the first schema that we're processing about this particular information, we tend to rely on that too much because it's the first schema that we have and the schema that we use to filter other schemas that we've never experienced. And the last one would be the peak end rule. So what happens is that people tend to judge something during the peak and end of an event or situation. And this is supported by Gneiman et al. In 1993. So the next one would be the tendency to look for information which confirms beliefs. And well, a very common example of this would be confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a tendency to confirm a fact instead of falsifying it. And a study that supports this fact would be there was a study in 1968. This study is about how when you're given 4 card options and a requirement, instead of trying to falsify the rule, people tend to confirm it instead, which doesn't really answer the question. Oh god, my memory about that study is really bad that I don't think that even makes sense, but okay. Okay, so the next would be congruence bias. So since confirmation bias exists, some psychologists argue that it's actually not confirmation bias, but it's actually congruence bias. So congruence bias argues that people tend to look like as if they're trying to get a positive result instead of useful information. And this study is supported by Skirgi in 1980s. The last one would be illusory correlations. It's when there are two things that are actually not connected or in fact has no correlations, but people start to um, believe that there's a connection when they try to look for a pattern or a connection between them. So, um, usually, how this happens is when, in real life, we we start to see how certain races or certain behavior are associated with certain kind of things. And um, like in the slides, an example of this would be how stereotypes are formed. And a study that supports this is the Chapman and Chapman study in 1960s. So the last one would be the tendency to avoid mental stress from cognition. So cognitive dissonance is the mental stress caused by inconsistency. And when people experiences a cognitive dissonance, people tend to um, try to do things to prevent it. And this typically happens when there's two or more contradictory beliefs or ideas. One's action and one's belief are different or inconsistent. And if there's new information and existing beliefs are inconsistent. And studies that supports this would be the Friedman and Fraser in 1966 about induced compliance paradigm, and a book by Festinger, Regan, and Schachter in 1956 about when prophecy fails, where they investigated and undercover to pretend to be a part of a cult. And that's how they learned. And through that experience, they learned how cults prevented false beliefs from happening. Wait, sorry, let me rephrase this. So, by entering the cult, they learned that there are certain ways of how cults try to cope and survive through these false beliefs, and that's how cognitive dissonance existed. Okay, so now we're going into emotion and cognition. Emotion and cognition. In emotion and cognition, there are actually also a lot of theories that supports this. And through lots of these theories, we can know that the interaction between emotion and cognition is bidirectional. When we say bidirectional, we mean that there is no cause and effect with both of them, and we don't know which one causes which, but the emotion and cognition can interact with each other instead of having cause and effect. So there are I'm going to be explaining around like five five theories on emotion and cognition. And the first one would be the theory of emotion, which was proposed by James and Lang in 1884. So in this theory of emotion, they believe that how emotion works is that after a person experiences an environment, they would start experiencing a physiological reaction or a biological response. And after the biological response happened, our cognition or our mind would respond to the body with an emotion. But there's also another argument created by Cannon and Bart in 1927, which believes that the physiological change in emotion or cognitive processing happens simultaneously. So one doesn't cause one, but both of them happen at the same time when an environmental stimuli happen. So emotion is not a result, but rather something that happened at the same time. But then Scatter and Singer also proposed another theory on emotion, is that they believe that emotions were two-stage processing. So they believe that when your body reacts to environmental stimuli, your mind would interpret this reaction, this body's reaction, and then your mind would think of an emotion in response to this physical reaction. Another last theory that Lazarus tried to propose was that what happened is that the mind tried to assess the reaction of the environmental stimuli, and then after the mind assesses the environmental stimuli, the mind will try to generate physiological changes or physical reactions, and then after that, the cognition or the mind will try to interfere again and take control. And this was supported by Leduc in 1996. So other than these theories, we can also look back to how thinking and decision making is so we can look back to the thinking and decision making theories and connect them with how emotion influences cognition. So in the adaptive decision maker framework, we learned that one of the meta goals that they had was to minimize the experience of negative emotions. And as you can see, cognition was in some way influenced by emotion to avoid these negative emotions or to minimize it. And we can use this for your arguments on how thinking and decision making can relate to emotion and cognition. So another one would be a bias. An example of it would be the framing effect. And what happens in the framing effect, as we can see, is that people tend to try to avoid potential losses. And potential losses may be associated with negative emotion. And this is how our cognition make biases to avoid influencing our emotion in a negative way. The last one would be cognitive dissonance. As we said before, cognitive dissonance was done to avoid an unpleasant feeling of dissonance by introducing a bias in one's beliefs, the compromise between the inconsistency in beliefs or one's actions, and etc. So a very popular theory when it comes to emotion and cognition would be the flashbulb memory, which was proposed by Brown and colleague in 1977. So it was an event that is remembered as a vivid memory. A flashbulb memory itself it is an event remembered as a vivid memory because of the element of surprise and emotionally arousing attribute. So, um, there are two there are two mechanisms when it comes to the flashbulb memory, which is the mechanism of formation and maintenance of. Did I just made a typo? Um, the mechanism of maintenance. I'm sorry. It's supposed to be the mechanism of maintenance, but I don't know why I messed up with that. Um, I'll remind myself to check on the presentation once again. Oh my God, I make so much mistakes today. Okay, so the mechanism of formation is basically how the flashbulb memory forms, and um, as I said before, when there's an environmental stimuli, and then the person that experiences the environmental stimuli experiences the element of surprise and personal consequentiality, or um, causes emotional arousal in the person, a flashbulb memory is formed. And how they maintain this flashbulb memory is by overt rehearsals or by covert rehearsals, aka reconstructing the event by continuously telling it to other people as a form of rehearsal, or replaying the event in one's memory repeatedly. By doing this, it consolidates the memory traces. And as you can see in this picture, which was totally not taken from the IB Psychology Oxford book, these are this is a way to visualize how flashbulb memory can work. The first part is, again, like I said before, the formation, and then the maintenance. And several studies that can support the flashbulb memory would be shared et al. In 2007, which talks about the about amygdala's role in flashbulb memory. And the second one would be Nasser et al. In 1996 about rehearsal's role in flashbulb memory. And the last one would be by Tarico and Rubin in 2003 about how flashbulb memory is special, but only special because of their perceived accuracy. So, three of these examples actually play a very big role in the formation of the flashbulb memory theory, because the first one, shared et al. 2007, it showed how the flashbulb memory has something to do with amygdala. And amygdala has something to do with emotions, fear, and etc., which shows that flashbulb memories are special or unique in a way because memory normally doesn't work. Memory normally doesn't work like this. Memory normally doesn't pass through the amygdala. And this also shows that flashbulb memory is highly influenced by emotion. And Nasser et al. In 1996 proved how rehearsal is actually somewhat important in the flashbulb memory, because like other memories, every memory would deteriorate, and the flashbulb memory is not an exception. So, and as we can see from the previous multi-storm memory model, we can see that a way to strengthen our memory would be by rehearsing and continuously rehearsing. And Nasser et al. 1996 proved that rehearsing is actually somewhat important in flashbulb memory in helping to preserve the memory's um, details and the memory's accuracy. Um, Meanwhile, Tarico and Rubin in 2003 investigated on the longitudinal affects the longitudinal accuracy of these kind of memories, and they found out that just like normal memories, flashbulb memories actually deteriorate, and they its accuracy also reduces or decreases. However, flashbulb memory in some ways is still very special because the people who has these flashbulb memories believes that the flashbulb memories are very special in a way that because they're emotionally affected by it, they believe that they remember the memory accurately even though they don't. So now the SL content is done, we're now going to jump into cognitive processing in a digital world. So any non-existing SL people can now go. Okay, so in digital technology and cognitive processing, there's a lot of studies that you can use to support this, and because in the HL you're not going to because in the HL you're not really going to talk about certain theories like the SL content or the SL-HL content. You only talk about the methods of some of these studies, the advantages and the disadvantages of digital technology and cognitive processing because it's a very new and controversial topic to talk about. So some of the studies that has relations with digital technology and cognitive skills would be Roser et al. About the interaction with digital technology, which is believed to may have improved cognitive skills. And then the next study would be Small and Forgan 2008 about the excessive exposure to digital technology. And in the long term, there's going to be negative side effects such as addiction to technology and many more. Like, for example, increased aggression because of digital technology, especially video games. Another study that one study that actually supports increased addiction, increased aggression due to video games would be Jendal et al. In 2004 about the correlation between gameplay and lower grades and the correlation of aggression and decreased pro-social behavior. Another study by Sanchez in 2012 believes that certain visual spatial related video games may improve your ability in visual spatial tests. And the study by Ferry and Poncer in 2001 found that effects of training using computer simulation was useful in improving one's skill. In this case, golfing. So, I didn't put any explanations in most of these because they're mostly individual and like cluttered when it comes to the theories. Um, so I guess I'll try to explain them one by one. Hopefully, that's not boring because it's gonna be very boring if I'm just explaining the main hypothesis of each of the study and the results of them. And so basically, in digital technology and cognitive processing, um, we can see all around us that we do more tasks in the previous generation, and we do more multitasking, or we do more variety of tasks than the previous generation. So examples of this would be the urge to check on your social media, opening multiple tabs on your laptop, and um, the very easy accessibility of multiple functions. In studies that try to investigate about multitasking's effect on cognitive processing would be Rosen, Carrier, and Cheever in 2013 about the correlation between lower GPAs and multitasking. And then Rosen et al. In 2011 also did a study about how slower response to text messages actually has correlation with better test performances. So this study shows that the Rosen-Carrier Cheever study may not necessarily be a good determination of lower GPAs than multitasking. It could have been about how fast you respond to text messages. In Loh and Kanai in 2014 did a brain scan and found out that multitasking correlation is in the brain would be with this ACC or anterior cingulate cortex in the cognitive control. So basically, they found that multitasking have correlations with lower cognitive control because your ACC or your anterior cingulate cortex becomes a smaller gray matter density. So we can also talk about digital technology and empathy in human interaction. So did the internet just disconnected? Oh god, the internet's so bad. Okay. So I'll just continue. So there's correlations with digital technology and empathy in human interaction, and this correlate. For this, you can actually connect this with the other options of psychology, which would be the psychology of human relationships. And a study that supports this would be Carey et al. In 2015 about how empathy scores, virtual empathy scores, are lower than real life empathy scores, and how empathy is increased only if face-to-face networking sites are used. And it also found that video gaming decreases your empathy rate regardless of how frequent face-to-face networking was used. Oh, also, for your information, it's also very important to take all these studies and evaluate each of them instead of simply believing or using the results and establish a conclusion, especially in your ERQs, because in psychology studies, there's often a lot of there's often a lot of biases in the studies itself, and um, due to some of these biases, the studies might not be necessarily reliable or true to some extent. And then we can also relate digital technology with ADHD. Um, this can relate to abnormal psychology, and a study to support this would be Swing et al. In 2010 about the relationship between gaming and reduced classroom attention. Um, Again, if I'm not mistaken, this study doesn't have a lot of um, significant support, so it's better to take these kind of studies with a grain of salt, especially the newer ones, such as the ones relating to digital technology and cognitive processing, because it's actually a rather new concept, and I think Swing et al. Was rather like one of the more earlier studies that they have. So, and you know how in psychology it's also important to make sure that the studies have been replicated and proven that the replication is accurate. And in relations with digital technology and memory would be studies like Wegner et al. In 1985 on how they proposed an additional form of memory called transective memory systems. So, transective memory systems means that memory is divided, or certain some people would store certain memories, and this usually happens in a a small group of people who are very close. So they think that some people would memorize certain memories, and then some people would memorize other certain memories. So they would be able to know who to refer to when they don't remember that memory. So they can just rely on these people for travel. So for example, if a dad doesn't remember birthdays, the dad would rely on the mom because the mom does remember them. Or for example, um, the mom doesn't remember movie actors because the son does remember the movie actors. And then another study by Storm et al. In 2016 would be about how Google use may actually mean that our memory will rely on Google in the future than recalling the actual memory itself. So, some of these studies, are more of those kind of studies that we have, and I'm too lazy to explain all of them because you can simply just look at the brief hypothesis of them, and like learning one or two studies is actually enough. But I just want to explain more, but then I got lazy. But I've smacked all of them in the presentation, so it should be fine. Just read the presentation. So that's all for today's. That's all for today, and I hope this is helpful for you guys. Thank you.